Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. As Marcus brought his Mack truck to a halt, the sound of the diesel engine's rumbling faded into the humid night air. It was 2:15 a.m. The shoulder of Interstate 75 extended forever through the Georgia trees. It's a hot August day. Marcus had been driving for 19 years, transporting everything from furniture to farm equipment across the southeast United States, and the heat hadn't subsided even after sunset. The asphalt continued to radiate warmth from the harsh sun of the day, creating shimmering mirages that danced in his headlights like spectral apparitions. He was familiar with every truck stop, every way station, and every hazardous curve. Marcus had been seeing figures walking along the highway shoulder for the past 50 miles, but he initially thought they were hitchhikers or stranded drivers. However, tonight something had forced him to pull over, not mechanical issues or exhaustion, but something much more unsettling that he couldn't quite name. The figures, who seemed to be people of all ages, elderly men in hospital gowns, middle-aged women in blue dresses, children in pajamas, teenagers in school uniforms, all walked in the same direction, heading north against the flow of traffic, with a deliberate, measured gait that never changed. However, they all shared certain traits that made Marcus's skin stand out. The most unsettling thing about them was that, despite the bright illumination from Marcus' headlights, they cast no shadows. They all walked with their heads held high, staring straight ahead with expressions of serene contentment that seemed completely inappropriate for people wandering a dangerous highway in the middle of the night. None of them ever looked at approaching vehicles or tried to flag down help. His first reaction had been to stop and offer assistance when he saw an elderly woman in a faded hospital gown shuffle along the gravel shoulder near Valdosta an hour earlier. However, something about the woman's posture and movement had set off his survival instincts, alerting him that this wasn't a typical scenario. As he slowed his truck and pulled toward the shoulder, the woman turned. Her face was white and waxy, and her eyes reflected his headlights like an animal's. She had raised one bony hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons, and her smile had revealed teeth that were too white and perfect. Marcus had sped past her, his heart racing with unfathomable fear as he watched the woman in his mirrors. Since then, Marcus had counted at least a dozen more shoulder walkers, all of whom were moving north with the same purposeful stride and wearing the same calm expression. They appeared at regular intervals, roughly every 2 or 3 miles, as if they had never encountered her before, but the image of her face, that awful knowing smile, was etched in his memory. Marcus tried to make sense of what he was seeing while parked on the shoulder with his hazard lights flashing. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19 in the hopes of reaching other truckers who might have witnessed the same phenomenon. According to Breaker 19, this is southbound I-75 at mile marker 42. Are you seeing pedestrians on the shoulder tonight? This is northbound at marker 67. I've been tracking these people for 2 hours now, and I've counted over 40 so far. The radio crackled with static for a few seconds before a gruff voice said, "Yeah, I copy that, driver. I've been seeing them for the past 100 miles. Strangest damn thing witnessed. They just keep walking no matter what the weather or traffic conditions are, traveling in the same direction." I attempted to stop and assist one of them, a young girl wearing a nightgown, but she simply ignored me as if I weren't there. Marcus turned on his microphone. Does anyone know where they're going or where they're coming from? I'll tell you what's really unsettling, though, because I passed the same elderly man 3 times tonight. He was dressed the same, walked the same, and did everything. The discussion went on for a few more minutes, during which truckers shared increasingly unsettling observations about the shoulder walkers. Some said they had seen the same people several times over the course of hours or even days. Others related incidents in which the walkers had abruptly appeared directly in front of their trucks, requiring emergency stops before disappearing. One driver even claimed to have followed a group of shoulder walkers to their apparent location, destination an unoccupied rest area that had been closed for renovations. According to his story, the walkers just entered the dimly lit building and vanished. As though the walls were impermeable to their passage, Marcus made the decision to carry out his own research. The mystery surrounding the shoulder walkers had always piqued Marcus' interest, and he didn't have to wait long as he started driving slowly north, keeping his eyes open for the next figure. About 5 miles up the road, his headlights revealed a man in his 40s, wearing a business suit that appeared to have been expensive once, but was now torn and stained. The man walked at the same measured pace as the others, with his briefcase swinging rhythmically at his side. Marcus pulled alongside the walking man. The man turned to face Marcus, and the trucker instantly regretted stopping. The figure's face was gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that appeared to be bruises. His mouth was set in a slight smile that never wavered, and his eyes held an emptiness that suggested no one was home. He rolled down his passenger window and said, "Hey buddy, you need a ride? It's not safe to be walking out here." Despite his instinct to drive away as quickly as possible, Marcus asked, "Where are you going?" The man's smile widened slightly. "North, always north, to the place where the walking ends and the real work begins. Thank you for your concern," he said behind them, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Despite the intense heat, Marcus felt cold. "What kind of work?" he said. "The kind that requires fresh volunteers," the man said. Then there was a tone in his voice that made Marcus' teeth hurt. "People like you," he said, stopping to assist strangers in the middle of the night. People who ask too many questions. Marcus noticed that the man's pupils had grown into vertical slits, like those of a reptile, as his eyes started to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. The businessman's smile showed teeth that were too many and too sharp for a human mouth, and Marcus floored the accelerator as his truck lurched forward in an attempt to escape the encounter. As the distance grew, Marcus became increasingly horrified to see that the figure was somehow keeping up with his truck's movement without seeming to walk or run. The CB radio crackled to life with a voice that Marcus recognized as the businessman's, even though he was now several miles away. In his mirrors, he could see the man standing motionless on the shoulder, watching him drive away with those awful glowing eyes. "We've been watching you for a while, waiting for the right opportunity to invite you." Marcus grabbed his microphone with trembling hands. "How do you know my name? What do you want from me?" "We want you to join us, Marcus, so that you can become a part of something bigger than yourself. The walking is just the beginning," the voice said. "We're always looking for new team members, people who understand the importance of helping others find their paths." Marcus asked, unsure of the answer. "What line of work?" "You've shown curiosity, compassion, and the willingness to help strangers. These are valuable qualities in our line of work." Marcus came to the startling realization that the shoulder walkers weren't lost souls or victims, but rather recruiters working for a larger organization that used the highway system to find and gather potential members. The walking was a type of psychological testing. The shoulder is simply our interview process, a way to find candidates who have the right disposition. "What happens to people who join you?" Marcus asked, although he suspected he already knew the answer. "They find peace," the voice said. "No more worries about deadlines, fuel costs, or mechanical breakdowns. No more loneliness on the long hauls." The design was intended to draw people who would stop to help strangers in distress. The businessman's voice came back, now coming from multiple radio channels At once you're approaching the collection point, Marcus looked in his mirrors and noticed that the shoulder walkers were now coming out in greater numbers from the trees on both sides of the highway. They moved with increasing coordination, forming loose groups that seemed to be herding his truck toward some predetermined destination. The highway curved to the right ahead of Marcus, and he could see lights in the distance that didn't look like normal traffic. As he approached, he realized it was a huge group of shoulder walkers, hundreds of figures standing in perfect alignment. Marcus, don't be afraid. The transition is fairly painless. Most people find it rather liberating actually. All of them were facing Marcus's approaching truck and had the same calm smile on their faces that he had seen on the businessman's. Their eyes glowed with that same phosphorescent light, creating a constellation of unblinking eyes as they stood in military precision in rows that stretched from the median to the outer shoulders, blocking all traffic in both directions. Among the cars, trucks, and motorcycles that had seemingly been stopped by earlier gatherings, Marcus applied the brakes and stopped his truck approximately 50 yards away from the gathered crowd. Some of the drivers of these vehicles were now standing among the walkers, seemingly joining their ranks. The businessman showed up at Marcus. "Welcome to the end of your journey, Marcus," the businessman said, "and the beginning of your real purpose. Step out of the truck and let us show you what you've been missing all these years." Through the driver's side window, Marcus had not seen him approach, but up close the figures in human nature was even more apparent. His movements were too fluid and graceful for normal human anatomy, and his skin had a translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface. Marcus glanced at the gathered crowd and saw that many of the faces were those of truckers he had known for years who had just disappeared from the CB channels without warning. They all had the same contented look and the same vacant smile that suggested they had finally found what they had been looking for all their lives. The temptation was too great. The idea of joining a community where all of those worries would vanish was very alluring, but something deep inside of Marcus resisted the offer. Marcus had always been independent and valued his freedom over security or comfort. He was tired of being alone, tired of traveling endless distances, and tired of constantly having to make deliveries on time. His submission to some collective consciousness, no matter how serene, filled him with disgust. Rather than opening his door, Marcus put his truck in reverse and started to back away from the group. The shoulder walkers started approaching him right away, their calm faces remaining the same, but their pace sharply increasing. They moved with a natural speed and coordination, navigating obstacles like water. Marcus made a risky U-turn with his truck and started to drive south back the way he had come. He could see in his mirrors that the entire group was chasing him, moving across the highway as a single organism. They didn't run or walk. Instead, they just flowed forward at a speed that defied physics, gaining ground in spite of his truck's acceleration. "You're just postponing the inevitable, Marcus. We have agents all over the highway system. Every truck stops, every way station, every rest area. You can't drive forever, and when you stop, we'll be waiting." The chase went on 4 miles, with the shoulder walkers continuing their pursuit, while the businessman's voice offered commentary over the CB radio. Marcus realized that the businessman was correct. He couldn't outrun an organization that had infiltrated the entire trucking infrastructure, but he also knew that he couldn't give up to them and become just another fool in their never-ending army. As dawn broke over Georgia, the shoulder walkers slowly fell behind and vanished. As if daylight somehow made it harder for them to keep up the chase, Marcus kept driving south until when he finally felt safe enough to stop and call for assistance at the Florida border, he discovered that no one would believe his account. The Georgia State Police had no records of any unusual activity on the 75, and the dispatcher for the trucking company insisted that all of the drivers in their fleet were present and functioning normally. Marcus came to the realization that the shoulder walkers organization was much more sophisticated than he had anticipated. They were able to conceal their operations and falsify official documents, and they used the anonymity and remoteness of long-haul trucking to carry out their recruitment efforts. After that night, Marcus never drove alone on remote highways after dark. Instead, he began traveling in convoys with other truckers, and he always kept several forms of communication on hand in case his CB radio was compromised. The shoulder walkers were still out there, recruiting new members one kind-hearted driver at a time, and somewhere on a dark highway in Georgia, they continued their never-ending march northward in search of the next trucker. Most importantly, Marcus never stopped to help strangers walking along the highway shoulder, despite his conscience's strong urge to do so. Marcus had learned that sometimes the people who seem to need help the most are actually the ones you should be most afraid of. The road is full with predators who pose as victims, and the most dangerous ones are those who appeal to our better angels while guiding us towards something far worse than death, who will make the deadly error of stopping to help a stranger in the middle of the night. Moving on to our second story. The banging began at precisely 2:47 a.m. jolting. The first thing Derek thought was that another truck had sideswiped him. But as he sat up in his bunk and listened to the silence that followed, he realized something much stranger was happening. Derek had been parked at this rest area for less than 2 hours when he was awakened in his sleeper compartment like a gunshot in the Pennsylvania darkness. 3 thunderous impacts against the right side of his Kenworth, each powerful enough to rock the entire 40-ton rig on its suspension. Obligatory 8-hour rest before continuing his run from Pittsburgh to Boston. The lot was almost deserted, save for 2 large rigs parked 100 yards ahead of him, a white Volvo and a red Freightliner, both of which had running lights that glowed like sleeping giants in the darkness before dawn. The rest area itself was one of those abandoned locations constructed by Pennsylvania's Department of Transportation. A single flickering street light cast weak yellow light across the crumbling asphalt, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift with each flicker of the dying bulb. The building was in the 1970s and had been neglected since a cracked picnic table was scattered around a small building that housed restrooms so filthy that most truckers preferred to use the woods. Derek grabbed his flashlight and looked out his passenger window. He checked his driver's side mirror and saw nothing out of the ordinary, just empty parking spaces and the dark tree line that surrounded the rest area. The banging came again, this time from the left side of his truck, and this time it was 3 more impacts that were perfectly spaced and delivered. He had expected to see damage from whatever had struck his truck, but the side of his trailer looked perfectly normal, no dents, scratches, or indication that anything had made contact with the metal. Derek had been trucking for 12 years and had heard everything from blown tires to engine fires, but this was something completely different that defied rational explanation. The entire cab shook with tremendous force, and he could hear his coffee mug rattling in its holder. However, when he looked out his driver's window, he saw nothing that could have caused the noise. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19 in an attempt to contact the other drivers in the lot. Breaker 19 is the Kenworth in the rear of the rest area. Anyone else hearing loud banging noises? The radio crackled with static for a few seconds before a gruff voice answered. The impacts were too strong and precise to be the result of wind or settling metal, and no one was visible outside his truck who could be at fault. Yes, I am copping that, driver. I have been hearing something pounding on all of our trucks for the past 10 minutes, but I am unable to identify what it is. A second voice entered the conversation, this one younger and more apprehensive. It is the white Volvo. Whatever it is moving between our rigs. I saw something dark pass by my windshield, but it was moving too quickly for me to identify it, and Derek felt a chill that the first voice said has nothing to do with the cool Pennsylvania night. Anyone got eyes on what we're dealing with here? Negative, but I'll tell you what, I've been driving for 23 years and I've never experienced anything like this. It's like something's testing our trucks to see if we're awake." The banging continued, hitting all 3 trucks this time. Whatever was out there was hitting each vehicle with the same methodical precision, and Derek could hear the impacts reverberating across the rest area at the same time. The sound was deafening, like someone swinging a sledgehammer against sheet metal, but there was a rhythm to it that suggested intelligence rather than random violence, so Derek chose to look into it. The rest area itself was eerily quiet, as if whatever had been making the noise had suddenly stopped. He put on his boots, got his baseball bat from behind his seat, and then silently opened his door and went outside into the night. The air was heavy with humidity and the smell of diesel exhaust, and he could hear the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. He walked around his truck, shining his flashlight beam across every surface in search of signs. There were handprints on the side of his trailer, dozens of them pressed into the metal, if the aluminum had been soft clay. The prints were human in shape, but incorrect in size and proportion. The fingers were too long, the palms were too narrow, and they were arranged in patterns that suggested the creature responsible had far more hands than the typical number. Derek noticed this even though the metal was unmarked. Derek's flashlight beam swept across the ground surrounding his truck, revealing more evidence of the enigmatic visitor. The prints in the dirt revealed a bipedal creature with feet that were at least 18 inches long and equipped with what appeared to be claws instead of toes. The stride length between prints was almost 6 feet, indicating something that was either extremely tall or able to move at superhuman speed. The CB radio in his truck sounded as the Volvo driver's anxious voice said, "Hey guys, I think I see it. Something large, perhaps 8 or 9 feet tall, was moving between the trees at the edge of the lot. Watching us." Derek turned his flashlight toward the tree line and noticed a pair of eyes reflecting the beam back at him. Derek saw the eyes move laterally through the trees, circling the rest area, like a predator studying its prey. "I see it too," Derek said into his radio. "Whatever it is, it's been checking out our trucks." There were handprints all over the place. They were too high off the ground to be any typical animal, and they had an intelligence behind them that was unmistakably aware and calculating. The older driver's voice came over the radio with a tone of grim experience, and the footprints over my trailer suggested something that wasn't natural. "I think we should leave, boys. I've heard stories about things that hunt truckers at remote rest areas, and this fits the pattern. They test your defenses first, see if you're awake and alert, and then they make theirs more than one of them." Derek realized with increasing horror as the banging resumed with renewed intensity. This time, however, the impacts weren't random. Rather, the creature was pounding out a complex pattern that sounded almost like communication. The beats echoed off the nearby trees and appeared to be answered by similar sounds from deeper in the forest. Conversing with one another, the tree eyeballs grew into a constellation of reflected light that encircled the rest area. Derek counted at least a dozen pairs of eyes, all of which were at the same abnormal height and intently predatorily observing the 3 trucks. The animals were coordinating their approach, taking advantage of the darkness and their greater numbers. The banging stopped suddenly, but was replaced by a much more terrifying sound, the scraping of claws against metal. The creatures started climbing onto the trucks. Derek could hear them moving across the trailer roofs, their weight making the suspension groan and creak. Their clawed feet moved surprisingly stealthily for such large creatures. The creatures were humanoid in general shape, but incorrect in every detail. They were too tall and thin, with limbs that bent in ways that human joints couldn't accommodate. Derek found purchase on the smooth metal surfaces and ran back to his cab, climbing inside, unlocking the doors behind him. Through his windshield, he could see dark shapes moving across the other trucks silhouetted against the weak glow of the streetlight. One of the creatures fell from the Freightliner's roof and landed right in front of Derek's truck. In the harsh glare of his headlights, he saw what they were dealing with for the first time. The creature was almost 9 feet tall, with grey mottled skin that appeared to have never seen sunlight. Its arms were excessively long, reaching nearly to the ground, and ended in hands with an excessive number of fingers, each tipped with gleaming claws. The most unsettling aspect of the creature was its face, which was vaguely human in shape, but stretched and warped like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its eyes were big and entirely black, with no pupils or irises visible, and its mouth was full of teeth that appeared better suited to tearing meat than any type of regular diet. The creature tilted its head as it observed Derek's truck moving, with the odd vigor of a scientist was studying a specimen when it came up to the driver's side door and started tapping on the window with one long finger. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, like Morse code, and Derek grabbed his CB microphone with trembling hands. "They're right outside our trucks," the Freightliner driver said, "and I can see one of them clearly, and it's not human. We need to get out of here now." On my count, we all start our engines and Derek threw his transmission into gear and started to move forward, but the creature at his door didn't run away from the noise. Instead, it started pounding on his window with increasing intensity, its claws scratching the safety glass. Derek turned his key and felt a wave of relief as his diesel engine roared to life, but his relief was fleeting. As the 3 trucks fled the rest area, more of the creatures came out of the trees and started chasing them. Their long legs covered the ground with loping strides that reminded Derek of wolves chasing prey. The chase continued onto the interstate, where the creatures continued to pursue despite the truck's increase in speed. They ran in formation, communicating with one another through a series of clicks. Derek pushed his truck to its maximum speed, the engine temperature gauge rising dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was designed to deliver. In his mirrors, he could see the creatures falling behind their entrance, finally reaching its limits, and whistles that echoed the noise of the diesel engines. Some of them tried to jump onto the moving trucks, their claws scraping against metal as they tried to find purchase on the smooth surfaces. However, he didn't slow down until he arrived at the next truck stop, which was a well-lit establishment with lots of other cars and people nearby. The 3 drivers gathered in the truck stop's restaurant to discuss their experiences and try to make sense of what they had seen. All of their trucks had dents and claw marks from the creature's attempts to break in, as well as fingerprints from the attack. However, when they attempted to report the incident to the authorities, Derek never stopped at that rest area again and cautioned other truckers to avoid it whenever possible, for they discovered that no one would believe their story. The Pennsylvania State Police took their statements, but obviously believed the report to be the result of overactive imaginations and too much caffeine. The truck stop security cameras had malfunctioned during the time of the chase, leaving no visual evidence of the creature's existence. The incident altered all 3 drivers in ways that were difficult to describe. They became more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, and less trusting of remote rest areas that seemed too quiet or too empty. He also knew that the creatures were still out there, hunting and testing the defenses of unwary drivers who made the mistake of parking in isolated locations. The banging in the night wasn't random. It was a test by the creatures to see which trucks held easy prey and which ones contained alert armed drivers. They were sharing information about dangerous locations and unusual encounters with other truckers who were willing to listen, and they had discovered that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for, creatures that used the darkness and isolation of the trucking life to hunt for victims. The road never sleeps, and neither do the creatures that hunt along its edges, testing our defenses and waiting for the moment when we let our guard down. Let's move to our third story. The GPS on Tony's dashboard showed nothing but empty highway for the next day, and somewhere in the darkness of Pennsylvania, at a forgotten rest area that most maps don't show, the creatures continue their nocturnal hunts, waiting for the next group of truckers who will make the fatal mistake of stopping. For the night in the wrong place, the temperature gauge read -22, which is so cold that diesel fuel could freeze and kill a man in minutes if his truck broke down in the wrong place. He was traveling 60 meters in his Peterbilt through the isolated wilderness of northern Idaho, just after midnight on a chilly February night. The snow was falling so heavily that his windshield wipers could hardly keep up with the accumulation. Even in good weather, the route through the Bitterroot Mountains was dangerous, with steep grades, hairpin turns, and drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into rocky canyons. In conditions like tonight, it was almost suicide-threatening, but the Spokane construction company needed the load by morning, and Tony knew these mountain roads better than most locals because he had been hauling lumber from the mills around Cardellon for 8 years. The paranoia began about 50 miles ago, shortly after he had passed the final small town before entering the true wilderness. At first, it was just a persistent feeling that something wasn't right, the kind of unease that seasoned drivers learn to trust. But as the miles added up and the snow kept falling, the feeling deepened into a conviction that he was being followed, hunted by something that moved through the forest with his truck. Tony had attempted to write off the feeling as the result of exhaustion and loneliness, but it was getting harder to ignore the evidence. He saw dark shapes pacing his truck between the trees, seemingly keeping the same speed and direction despite the challenging terrain. In this remote area, where most transmissions were blocked by mountains, the CB radio had been silent 4 hours. However, tonight, the silence felt oppressive, as if something was actively jamming the frequencies to prevent him from calling for help. Tony's cell phone had lost communication, and his satellite phone showed no signal. The first obvious indication of trouble came when Tony saw tracks in the snow beside the highway. They were large, easily twice the size of human footprints, and they showed a stride length that suggested something moving at incredible speed. Tony saw the tracks in his headlights as he rounded a sharp curve running parallel to the road in the soft powder that had accumulated on the shoulder. Given how little snow had accumulated in the tracks, Tony realized that they were new and had been made within the last few minutes. Whatever was causing them to not only follow his truck, but also get close enough to leave traces of its passage in the areas that were lit by his headlights, made Tony push harder on the accelerator, moving his truck faster than was safe on the icy mountain road. Even with his chains and experience, he could feel the trailer slipping a little on the curves as the diesel engine roared up the steep grade. However, the risk of losing control seemed far less dangerous than slowing down and letting whatever was out there approach. The tracks increased as Tony continued climbing into the mountains. What had begun as one set of prints turned into 2, then 4, and then even more. Tony's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and sweat was beating on his forehead despite the cold air. He had heard stories from other drivers about encounters with strange creatures in remote areas, but he had always written them off as tall tales or the like. They crossed the highway, vanished into the forest, and reappeared on the other side, suggesting a pack of creatures that was coordinating their movements and surrounding his truck. Products of too much coffee and not enough sleep. Those stories seemed much more plausible now that he had proof that something was actively pursuing him through the Idaho wilderness. The attack happened unexpectedly as Tony was traveling down a particularly dangerous stretch of road that wound along the edge of a deep canyon. A large object struck the passenger side of his cab with incredible force, rocking the entire truck and spider-weaving the window. Tony struggled to keep his composure as in the brief moment that whatever had attacked him was visible in his peripheral vision. Tony saw something that defied description. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in thick dark fur that glistened with ice crystals. Its limbs were disproportionately long and muscular, and its face combined human and animal. The truck skidded toward the guardrail, the trailer jackknifing slightly before he managed to straighten it out. The creature landed in the snow next to the road and started running alongside Tony's truck right away, its strong legs carrying it through the deep powder with ease. Its features suggested intelligence behind the predatory instincts. It moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, covering ground with bounds that would have been impossible for any other animal. Other creatures emerged from the forest. Tony counted at least 6 of them, all moving with the same supernatural speed and coordination, and they appeared on both sides of the highway like ghosts emerging from the swirling snow. They ran in formation, communicating with one another through howls and calls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. One of the creatures leapt onto Tony's trailer, its claws finding even over the roar of his diesel engine and the howling of the wind. Tony could hear it moving across the roof due to purchase on the metal surface. Its weight was causing the suspension to groan and the entire rig to sway dangerously. Tony grabbed his CB radio and started broadcasting on the emergency channel in the hopes that someone would pick up his transmission. Mayday, mayday. I'm being attacked by unknown hostiles on Highway 95 mile marker unknown. I need the help of any local law enforcement right away. The radio crackled with static, but no one answered. Tony was left all alone with whatever was going on outside his truck, cut off from assistance by the storm and the mountains. The creature on his trailer started. As it approached the cab, Tony saw with increasing horror that it was attempting to reach his fuel tanks. If it succeeded in puncturing them, he would be left stranded in the wilderness without heat, power, or a means of escape. It was moving forward with the assurance of something that had accomplished this before Tony could see its shadow in his mirrors. With every turn, Tony could feel his trailer sliding toward the canyon's edge as he started to swerve back and forth across the highway in an attempt to shake the creature loose. However, the alternative of letting the creature disable his truck seemed even riskier. The creature held on with unnatural strength, its claws creating deep gouges in the metal that struggled to keep its hold, and Tony could hear it making. The creatures weren't just hunting him, they were injuring him and pushing him in a certain direction. Whenever he attempted to change course or take a different route, they would seem to block his path, leaving him no way to escape. The sounds were a mix of growl and human speech, as if they were attempting to communicate with him or possibly coordinate with the other members of its pack. Tony's situation became even more dire when he realized that this was a planned trap rather than an unplanned attack. These creatures weren't just predators. They were well organized, intelligent, and skilled at hunting vehicles on these mountain roads. They were also familiar with the terrain, the weather patterns, and the best ways to isolate and capture their prey. The creature on his trailer joined him, and Tony felt the extra weight affecting his truck's handling. The steering became sluggish, and the brakes felt spongy, as if the creature's presence was somehow interfering with his truck's mechanical systems. Tony pushed his truck to its absolute limits, the engine temperature gauge rising dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was built to deliver. Tony realized that he was being driven toward an ambush point, a place where the creatures had set up more traps or obstacles. Just as he thought things couldn't get any worse, he crested a hill. The pack started to close in, with creatures running alongside both sides of his truck and more visible in the forest ahead. They moved with perfect coordination and military units carrying out a well-rehearsed operation. Tony had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. He could try to stop before hitting the tree, but that would leave him trapped and helpless while the creatures closed in, and saw what the creatures had been hurting him toward. The highway ahead was blocked by a massive tree that had been purposefully felled across both lanes, its trunk positioned at the perfect height to stop a truck without completely destroying it. Instead, Tony decided on a third option that was so risky that it almost seemed suicidal. He could try to smash through the barrier, but his truck probably wasn't strong enough to move a tree that big, and the impact would probably disable his vehicle. He aimed his truck at the guardrail on the right side of the highway in the hopes of breaking through and making his getaway down the mountainside. It was a last-ditch gamble that would most likely result in his death, but it was instead of being killed by whatever was pursuing him. Tony was thrown against his door with bone-jarring force after a tremendous impact with the guardrail. The metal barrier held for a brief moment before giving way with a screech of twisted steel, and Tony's truck plunged over the edge of the canyon, the trailer jackknifing. It followed the cab into the abyss for several terrifying seconds. He was certain that he was going to die in the most brutal way possible as he tumbled through space while struggling to stay conscious. However, luck was on his side that night when his truck collided with a grove of pine trees about 30 feet below the highway. The branches and trunks of the trees absorbing much of the impact and preventing the vehicle from continuing its fall into the deeper. Tony was flung around the truck like a rag doll in some parts of the canyon, but he was spared death by his seatbelt and the truck's safety features. When the world finally stopped spinning, Tony was left hanging upside down in his truck, with his entire body hurting from the impact and blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. His truck was wedged between several large trees, and the cab, tilted at an absurd angle, but still intact. The electrical system was still working, giving him heat and lights. Even though the engine had died in the crash, Tony was able to unbuckle his seatbelt and ride himself before he started to assess his situation. His truck was totaled, his cargo was all over the mountainside, and he was stuck in a blizzard with no way to call for help. But for the time being, that was enough. The creatures were moving along the canyon's edge above him, and Tony could hear their calls reverberating through the forest as they tried to find a way to get to him. They persisted, but the terrain favored him. The steep slope and dense trees made it difficult for them to descend to his location. Tony spent the remainder of the night huddled in his cab, using his emergency supplies to stay warm while he waited for dawn. The animals kept their watch above, but as the hours went by, their calls grew fewer and farther between. By the time the sun rose over the Idaho mountains, they had completely vanished, leaving only footprints in the snow as proof of their presence. Rescue arrived 12 hours later when a search helicopter discovered Tony's truck wreckage. The official report attributed the accident to bad weather and tired drivers. When he eventually resumed trucking, Tony knew what he had experienced and carried that knowledge with him. He never drove the Idaho mountain roads again, preferring to take longer routes that kept him on busier highways with more traffic and better communication coverage. However, no mention was made of the creatures that had forced him off the road. Tony's story of the attack was written off as a hallucination caused by trauma and hypothermia. They were clever, well organized, and patient enough to plan intricate operations that could take weeks to carry out. Most importantly, they had a thorough understanding of human psychology, which allowed them to take advantage of our predictable reactions to danger. Tony began sharing his story with other truckers, warning that they were still hunting and using the remote highways of America to trap unwary drivers. The wise ones, the seasoned drivers who had learned to trust their guts, started avoiding certain routes and traveling in convoys when they had to venture into isolated areas. He warned them about the dangers of driving alone through remote wilderness areas, especially during severe weather when help was far away. Some listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time on the road. The wreckage of Tony's truck still lies among the pine trees in a canyon in the Idaho mountains, where the snow fully melts. A monument to the night when a driver's quick thinking and desperate courage allowed him to escape from something that shouldn't exist. They realized that the highway was home to predators that no safety manual could prepare you for. These creatures used the vastness of the American wilderness to hunt for prey. Let's move on to our fourth story. The headlights of Ray's Kenworth pierced the darkness as he drove through the twisting back roads of rural Alabama, his trailer full of auto parts headed for a Montgomery factory. The wilderness never sleeps, and neither do the things that hunt in its deepest, darkest corners, waiting for the next traveler who will venture too far from the safety of civilization. It was 3:30 a.m. Ray had been driving these southern routes for 16 years, and he knew every truck stop, every speed trap, and every shortcut between Birmingham and the Gulf Coast. However, tonight Ray wasn't following his usual route. It was a humid September night, and the air was heavy with the smell of kudzu and pine sap that drifted through his slightly open window. The GPS on his dashboard indicated a network of county roads and state highways that would prolong his journey by 3 hours, but it was preferable to sitting in traffic until dawn. Ray and dozens of other truckers were forced onto the secondary highways that wound through Alabama's rural heartland after a massive pileup on I-65 closed the interstate 4 hours. The detour had taken them past abandoned farmhouses, and overgrown Ray was about 20 meters outside of a town called Millerville when he noticed the flashing lights ahead. The small towns he had passed through were silent and dark, with main streets lined with boarded-up storefronts and rusted gas station signs advertising prices from a bygone era. It was the kind of landscape that time had forgotten, where cell phone towers were uncommon and the closest help might be 50 meters away. Ray slowed his truck and pulled alongside the ambulance, expecting to see paramedics tending to an accident victim or possibly loading someone into the back of the vehicle. At first, he thought it might be a police roadblock or an accident scene, but as he approached, he realized it was an ambulance parked on the highway shoulder. The red and white strobes on the emergency vehicle painted the surrounding trees in alternating colors, creating a surreal light show in the darkness. Rather, he noticed a lone EMT standing next to the open rear doors, frantically waving at his truck. The man, who looked to be in his 30s and was dressed in the typical rural emergency medical service uniform, had a look of genuine desperation on his face. Ray rolled down his window and yelled, "You need help. I can call for backup on my CB." "Thank God you stopped," the EMT said, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder as he jogged over to Ray's truck. His voice had a thick Alabama accent. "I need to get this guy to the hospital in Montgomery, which is 40 miles away, but I have a critical patient in the back, but my engine died and my radio isn't working." It was an older ambulance, likely from the 1990s, with rust spots around the wheel wells and a paint job that had seen better days. Rural emergency services frequently worked on tight budgets, so the condition of the vehicle wasn't particularly suspicious, but something about the circumstance made Ray uneasy. "What's wrong with your patient?" Ray asked. Ray could see a figure lying on a gurney inside the ambulance, covered with a white sheet up to the neck. The EMT responded, "Single vehicle rolled over in a ditch," saying that the driver had internal bleeding and possibly spinal injuries. "I was able to stabilize him, but he needs surgery within an hour or he won't survive." Everything appeared normal, but something about the EMT's behavior was raising red flags in Ray's subconscious. "Why don't you call for another ambulance?" Ray asked. "Surely there's backup available." The patient appeared to be unconscious, and Ray could see what appeared to be medical equipment surrounding the gurney. Ray hesitated because his trailer was full of car parts and there was no space for a gurney, and he wasn't sure if his insurance would cover it. The EMT shook his head. "The closest unit is more than an hour away, and this guy doesn't have that kind of time. Look, I know this is an odd request, but could you give us a ride? Your truck is big enough to carry the gurney in the trailer, and I can watch the patient while he's being transported." "I don't think that's going to work," Ray said cautiously. "My trailer's full, and I'm not equipped for medical transport." More importantly, the EMT's story didn't add up. If there had been a serious accident 10 miles ago, why hadn't Ray seen any evidence of it? There were no skid marks, no debris, and no other emergency vehicles responding to the scene. "How about I give Montgomery a call in advance and ask them to send another ambulance to meet you halfway?" "That's not going to work either," the EMT replied, his voice taking on a sharper edge with the words, "This patient needs immediate transport and you're the only option." The EMT's demeanor shifted slightly, and Ray saw something cold and cunning behind the man's eyes. The EMT interrupted, and Ray's hand instinctively went to the pistol he kept in his door panel. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I'll call for backup on my CB, and you're going to help us." His voice seemed to have authority that went straight to Ray's nervous system, bypassing his conscious mind. "You're going to pull your truck over to that rest area up ahead, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do." Ray found himself slowing down the truck and searching for the rest area the EMT had mentioned, despite the fact that every sensible thought in his head was telling him to leave as quickly as possible. The rest area turned out to be nothing more than a dirt pull-off with a few picnic tables and an outhouse that appeared to have been neglected for years. Ray pulled his truck into the small lot. As soon as Ray turned off his engine, the compulsion stopped and he regained control of his movements. He reached for his CB radio, but it was only producing static. His cell phone was not showing any signal, and he was unable to activate his satellite emergency beacon. Ray's movements felt robotic and uncontrollable, and the EMT followed him into the ambulance, parking so close to his truck that it would be difficult for him to flee. "We want you to join our patient," Ray said, his hand clutching his pistol but not yet drawing it, as the EMT appeared at Ray's driver's side window, no longer bothering to maintain his helpful facade. "Get out of the truck," he ordered, and Ray noticed that the man's eyes had taken on an unnatural gleam in the darkness. "What do you want?" Ray asked. Ray looked toward the ambulance and noticed that the rear doors were now open, revealing the interior in all its horrifying detail. What he had mistook for medical equipment was actually a collection of restraints, surgical instruments, and other items. The EMT's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp and numerous for a human mouth. "He's been asking for company, and we think you'd be perfect for the role." The man strapped to the gurney was conscious and aware, his eyes wide with fear, as he struggled against the leather restraints that held him in place. His body was covered with surgical incisions that had been made with clinical precision, and tubes and wires ran from various wounds to machines that monitored things that appeared more suited to torture than treatment. The figure on the gurney was a patient, but not the kind Ray had anticipated. Ray pulled out his pistol and aimed it at the EMT, but the man didn't appear alarmed by the weapon. "He's been with us for 3 days now," the EMT said in a conversational tone. "We've learned so much from him about human physiology, pain tolerance, and the limits of consciousness, but he's starting to wear out, and we need fresh material for our research." The EMT responded, "We're exploring the boundaries between life and death, between healing and harm. It's fascinating work, really. Most people don't appreciate the artistry involved in keeping someone alive while systematically dismantling their body." The research examined Ray's demands regarding the intersection of medicine and suffering. They carried instruments that resembled a cross between surgical instruments and medieval torture devices, and their faces displayed expressions of clinical detachment that was somehow more terrifying than outright malice. More figures emerged from the ambulance, all dressed in medical uniforms, but moving with a coordination that suggested they weren't entirely human. Ray realized he had stumbled into the territory of something that used the cover of emergency medical services. "To you're not EMTs," Ray said, backing toward his truck while keeping his weapon trained on the group. "Oh, but we are," the leader retorted. "We're just not the kind that saves lives. We're the kind that studies them, that explores." The ambulance served as their mobile laboratory, enabling them to conduct their experiments while moving from location to location to avoid detection. Ray climbed back into his truck and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened when he turned the key. The electrical system was completely dead, as if something had drained all of the power from his vehicle. Through his windshield, he could see the phony EMTs approaching, their instruments moving with the patient confidence of predators who had done this quite a few times before. Ray ran toward the tree line, hoping to lose himself in the Alabama woods until dawn brought the possibility of rescue. In desperation, Ray kicked out his passenger window and climbed through the opening, dropping to the far side of his truck. He could hear the creatures moving around the vehicle, searching for him with the methodical efficiency of seasoned hunters, carrying an inhuman quality that implied they weren't communicating with normal vocal cords. The forest was dark and dense, with the sounds of nocturnal creatures that seemed to go silent as Ray crashed through the underbrush. He could hear his pursuers moving through the trees with a grace that suggested they were more comfortable in the wilderness than on the highways. Ray ran for what seemed like hours, his legs hurting from the unfamiliar exercise and his lungs burning. Every shadow could conceal one of them as dawn broke through the canopy. Ray found himself at the edge of a small town that was not on any map he had ever seen. The streets were deserted, the houses appeared abandoned, and there was no sign of normal human activity. He had no idea where he was going or how he would return to civilization, but staying ahead of his pursuers was his only chance of survival. When the state police finally arrived, they discovered no trace of the ambulance or its occupants. Ray's truck was found at the rest area, but it started normally and showed no signs of the electrical problems he'd experienced. Ray used his last quarters to call 911. The dispatcher who answered seemed perplexed by Ray's location and his story about phony EMTs with a mobile torture chamber. Ray's story was forgotten and filed away as just another trucker's wild story about strange encounters on remote highways. But Ray knew what he had experienced and carried that knowledge with him. When he started trucking again, he started avoiding rural routes whenever possible, sticking to major highways with better traffic and communication coverage. This was likely a hallucination caused by stress and exhaustion, and no investigation was done into the existence of the fake medical team. The phony EMTs were still out there using their mobile laboratory to conduct their horrifying experiments on unwary travelers. They knew human psychology well enough to take advantage of our instinct to help those in medical distress, and they used the authority of their uniforms to overcome their victims' natural caution. He also started carrying more weapons and emergency supplies in preparation for situations that no safety manual could foresee. Ray began cautioning other truckers about the risks of stopping for emergency vehicles in isolated locations, particularly when the circumstances appeared out of the ordinary or the staff behaved strangely. While some drivers paid attention, the majority dismissed his warnings as paranoid or the result of spending too much time remote roads. However, the more savvy and seasoned drivers who had learned to trust their guts started to question emergency situations more carefully and verifying before providing aid. They recognized that the highway was inhabited by predators who wore the uniforms of people they were taught to respect and trust. And somewhere on Alabama's back roads, an ambulance that isn't actually an ambulance still prowls the night in search of its next research subject. Inside its sterile interior, the instruments of healing have been corrupted into torture devices, and the oath to do no harm has been the road never sleeps, and neither do the things that stalk its edges while donning the faces of those who are meant to support us during our darkest moments. Let's move on to our fifth story. The brake pedal went straight to the floor without any opposition, and Mike's heart stopped when he realized as gravity dragged his 80,000-pound death machine toward the busy intersection at the bottom of the hill. Mike's worst nightmare came true. His fully loaded tanker truck, loaded with 8,000 gallons of gasoline, was speeding down a steep mountain grade in Colorado with no way to stop. Mike had been operating tanker trucks for 22 years, transporting everything from milk to dangerous chemicals throughout the western United States. He was more aware than most of the devastation his cargo could cause. A single spark could transform his truck into a huge bomb that could destroy entire city blocks and kill hundreds of innocent people. But he had never thought he would ever have to deal with a situation in which his vehicle would turn into an uncontrollable weapon of mass destruction. Mike checked his brakes at the top of the grade, following standard safety procedures, and everything had seemed normal. However, As his truck gained speed on the steep incline, the brake pedal felt as though it was disconnected from nothing. The brake failure had occurred unexpectedly as Mike started his descent down Rabideria's Pass, a notoriously dangerous stretch of highway that dropped 2,000 feet in elevation over the course of 12 miles, as other truckers on the highway started to notice his unpredictable driving. The CB radio sounded. "Hey eastbound tanker, you're coming down that hill awful fast. Everything okay up there?" Mike grabbed his microphone with one hand while struggling to control his steering wheel with the other. "Negative, good buddy. I've got total brake failure on a loaded fuel tanker. I'm doing 70 in climbing. I need immediate assistance clearing the road ahead." The response was prompt and well coordinated. The CB channels were flooded with voices offering guidance, encouragement, and updates on the road conditions ahead, but Mike knew that no amount of assistance could alter the basic physics of his predicament because his truck was too heavy and moving too quickly to be stopped by anything short of a catastrophic collision. Within minutes, truckers all over the area were broadcasting warnings and collaborating with state police to clear traffic from Mike's path. The highway ahead curved through a populated valley with schools, shopping malls, and residential neighborhoods. If he lost control in that area, the ensuing explosion would kill dozens of people. The runaway truck ramps were too far apart, and he had already passed the last one before his brakes failed. As his speed increased past 80 miles per hour, Mike started thinking about options that no driver should ever have to consider. The voice of another tanker driver who had been monitoring the situation crackled on Mike's radio. "This is Charlie in the blue Peterbilt. I've been hauling hazmat for 30 years, and I want you to know something. You're not alone up there. We're all with you, brother." Mike's eyes welled with tears. However, they also made him more determined. He understood that there was only one chance to stop his truck from turning into a weapon of mass destruction. A steep embankment 2 miles ahead, right before the highway entered the populated valley. If he could steer his truck off the road at that point, he might be able to crash in an unpopulated area where the explosion would only hurt himself. Mike said into his radio, "Charlie, I need you to call my wife." His voice steady despite his fear. "Tell her I love her and tell my kids their daddy was thinking about them at the end. Don't talk like that," Mike Charlie said. "We're going to figure this out. There's got to be another way." But Mike had, as Mike reached the spot, he said a final prayer and jerked his steering wheel sharply to the right. His truck left the highway at almost 90 miles per hour, sailing through the air. He had already made up his mind and could see the embankment ahead, a steep slope that dropped into a rocky canyon far from any buildings or people. This was his only chance to stop a catastrophe that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The blast was so strong that it registered on seismographs at the Colorado School of Mines, and the smoke plume could be seen from Denver. 60 miles away, however, Mike's sacrifice had been successful. The explosion was visible for miles, a massive fireball rising hundreds of feet into the Colorado sky before crashing into the rocky slope with tremendous force. Charlie and the other truckers who had been monitoring the situation pulled over. At the closest truck stop, many of them were too shaken to continue driving. They held an impromptu memorial service for Mike, sharing stories about his professionalism. Emergency responders discovered a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep, but no other damage beyond the destroyed vegetation on the surrounding hillsides. His commitment to safety and his ultimate sacrifice to save the lives of innocent people. The official investigation found that a manufacturing defect in the brake line fittings was the cause of Mike's brake failure, affecting hundreds of trucks across the country. The ensuing recall stopped similar incidents, but it was too late to save Mike's life. Mike's story became legendary among professional drivers, serving as a reminder of trucking companies started using his example in safety training programs to teach new drivers about the importance of equipment maintenance and the courage required to make the ultimate sacrifice. At the truck stop where Charlie and the other drivers had held their memorial, A small plaque was placed near the fuel pumps, reading, "The incredible responsibility that comes with hauling dangerous cargo and the heroism that ordinary people are capable of when faced with impossible choices. The road is safer because of drivers like Mike Thompson, who put the needs of others before his own." Mike's widow received letters from hundreds of people whose lives had been saved by her husband's decision. These people included parents whose children attended the school in the valley below, shoppers who had been in the stores along his intended route, families who lived in the neighborhoods that would have been destroyed by the wildflowers now grow in the crater where Mike's truck exploded, a natural memorial to a hero who made the hardest decision imaginable. Mike's story serves as a reminder that heroism isn't always about spectacular rescues or battlefield bravery. The canyon where Mike crashed became an unofficial shrine for truckers, a place where drivers would stop to pay their respects and remember the man who had given everything to protect people he'd never met. Mike Thompson could have attempted to save himself or hoped for a miracle that would have allowed him to survive. But instead he chose to make sure that others would live, even if it meant his own death. The highway never forgets its heroes, and heroes. Sometimes it's about regular people making extraordinary sacrifices when faced with situations that test the very core of their character. The realization that there are people among us who have the moral courage to make the ultimate sacrifice for strangers is ultimately more disturbing than the mechanical failure or the explosive ending. Mike's sacrifice reverberates through every safety procedure, every brake inspection, and every instance when a driver puts the welfare of others before their own survival. The road is filled with ordinary heroes driving ordinary trucks carrying ordinary cargo until circumstances demand that they become something extraordinary. When that time comes, some of them, like Mike Thompson, rise to meet it with a courage that embodies the best of human nature. And we rarely know who they are until their true character is revealed. Moving on to our sixth and last story, the snow is getting heavier now. David gripped the steering wheel of his Freightliner as he made his way down the dangerous mountain roads from the Cadine area. His trailer was full of freshly cut timber that was headed to a mill in Spokane. It was 11:30 p.m. after 14 years of hauling logs through the Idaho mountains since his discharge from the Army. David was familiar with every curve, grade, and hazardous location along the route. It was a bitter February night, and the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. This kind of cold could kill a man in minutes if his truck broke down in the wrong place. At first, it was just a persistent feeling that something wasn't right, the kind of unease that seasoned drivers learn to trust, but tonight felt different. The paranoia had begun about an hour ago, right after he had passed through the final small logging town before entering the true wilderness. With each mile that went by, the feeling had intensified from simple caution to a bone-deep certainty that he was being watched. David had attempted to write off the feeling as the result of exhaustion and loneliness, but it was getting harder to ignore the evidence. In his mirrors, he saw glimmers of movement between the snow-covered pines. Dark shapes appeared to pace his truck, keeping the same speed despite the challenging terrain. When he slowed down for a sharp curve, they slowed down. The figures were too big to be deer or elk, too well coordinated to be random wildlife, and too persistent to be the result of his imagination. The CB radio had been silent for the last 50 meters, which wasn't unusual in this isolated area where most transmissions were blocked by mountains. But tonight the silence felt oppressive, as if something was deliberately jamming the when David saw tracks in the fresh snow beside the highway. They appeared in his headlights as he rounded a hairpin turn running parallel to the road in the soft powder that had accumulated on the shoulder. The tracks were enormous, easily 3 times the size of his satellite phone, which showed no signal, and his cell phone, which had lost coverage an hour ago, leaving him completely cut off from the outside world. David's blood ran cold when he realized that the tracks were new, having only been made a few minutes ago. based on how little snow had accumulated in them. Whatever was making them was not only keeping up with his truck, but it was also close, enough to leave evidence of its passage in the areas illuminated by his lights. The size of human footprints and the stride length suggested something moving at incredible speed. Headlights. David pushed his loaded truck faster than was safe on the icy mountain road by pressing the accelerator harder. The diesel engine roared as it climbed the steep grades, and even with his chains and years of experience, he could feel the trailer sliding slightly on the curves. However, it seemed much riskier to slow down and let whatever was out there approach. David's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, and his perspiration was beating as the tracks multiplied as he continued his descent through the mountains. What had begun as a single set of prints turned into 2, then 4, and finally too many to count. They crossed the highway, vanished into the forest, and reappeared on the other side, suggesting a pack of creatures that was coordinating their movements. He had heard stories from other drivers about encounters with strange creatures in remote areas, but he had always written them off as tall tales or the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Now that he had proof that something was actively stalking him through the Idaho wilderness, those stories seemed much more credible. As David was navigating a particularly dangerous section of road that wound along the edge of a deep canyon, the attack came out of nowhere. Ravine. Something huge hit the passenger side of his cab with such force that it rocked the entire truck and spiderwebbed the window. David struggled to keep his truck under control. It skidded toward the guardrail, the trailer jackknifing slightly before he was able to straighten it out. In the brief time that whatever had attacked him was visible in his peripheral vision, David saw something that was difficult to describe. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but its limbs were disproportionately long and muscular, and its face blended human and animal features in a way that suggested intelligence behind the predatory instincts. Clad in thick, dark fur that glistened with ice crystals, the creature landed in the snow beside the road and started running alongside David's truck right away, its strong legs carrying it through the deep powder with ease. It moved with a fluid grace that was David counted at least 8 of them all. They were both beautiful and terrifying, covering the ground with bounds that would have been impossible for any normal animal. More creatures appeared from the forest on both sides of the highway, like ghosts materializing from the swirling snow. They ran in formation, communicating with one another through howls and calls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Despite the ice and snow, David could hear the creatures moving across the logs with the same supernatural speed and coordination. Their weight caused the chain holding his cargo to groan and strain, and the sound of their claws scraping against bark and metal could be heard even over the roar of his diesel engine and the howling of Mayday, Mayday. This is southbound on Highway 95 mile marker, unknown, under attack by unknown hostiles. Please provide immediate assistance from any law enforcement in the area. David grabbed his CB radio and started broadcasting on the emergency channel in the hopes that someone would hear him. The radio crackled with static, but no response came through, leaving David completely alone with whatever was outside his truck, cut off from assistance by the storm and the mountains. The creature on his trailer started to move forward with the assurance of something that had done this before David could see its shadow in his mirrors. As it got closer to the cab, he became increasingly alarmed to realize that it was attempting to reach his fuel tanks. If it succeeded in puncturing them, he would be left stranded in the wilderness without power, heat, or a means of escape. The creature held on with inhuman strength, its claws leaving deep gouges in the metal. It struggled to maintain control. In desperation, David started swerving back and forth across the highway in an attempt to shake the creature loose. This maneuver was extremely dangerous on the icy road, and he could feel his trailer sliding toward the edge of the ravine with each turn. However, the alternative of letting the creature disable his truck seemed even more dangerous. The creatures weren't just hunting him at random. They were injuring him and pushing him in a certain direction every time he tried to change course. David could hear it making sounds that were a mix of growl and human speech, as if it were attempting to communicate with him or possibly coordinate with the other members of its pack. The fact that this was a planned trap rather than an unplanned attack made David's situation even more dire. These creatures weren't just predators, they were intelligent, well organized, and skilled at hunting vehicles on these mountain roads. They knew the terrain. Alternatively, they would appear to block his path, leaving him with no choice but to continue on the road they wanted him to travel. David pushed his truck to its breaking point, the engine temperature gauge rising dangerously high as he demanded more power than the machine was built to deliver. The creature on his trailer joined him, and he could feel the extra weight affecting his truck's handling. The steering became sluggish, and the brakes felt spongy, as if the creature's presence was somehow disrupting the mechanical systems of his truck. The pack started to close in, with creatures running alongside his truck on both sides, and becoming more noticeable in the forest up ahead. They moved in perfect unison, much like a military unit carrying out a practiced operation. David became aware that he was being led to an ambush point, where the creatures had set up more obstacles or traps. The creatures had been preparing this trap, possibly 4 days or weeks, waiting for the right victim to come along. David had seconds to realize what was happening to him when he crested a hill and saw what they had been hurting him toward. The highway ahead was blocked by a huge fallen tree that had been purposefully placed across both lanes, its trunk positioned at the ideal height to stop a truck without completely destroying it. He could try to stop before hitting the tree, but that would leave him trapped and defenseless as the creatures closed in. He could try to smash through the obstacle, but his truck probably wasn't strong enough to move a tree that big, and the impact would probably disable his vehicle. Instead, David made a split-second decision that most people would never even think about. He veered toward a narrow opening in the It was a careless move, but staying on the main highway meant certain danger. Heading into the trees was a blind risk, but it offered the slim chance of escape from whatever was closing in. The impact with the guardrail sent shockwaves through the entire truck, but the barrier snapped under the weight of David's loaded trailer. David had no idea where the road led or whether it would eventually bring him back to civilization, but staying ahead of his pursuers was his only chance of survival. The truck plunged into the forest, following the overgrown logging road as it wound deeper into the wilderness. Behind him, he could hear the creatures howling with what sounded like frustration and rage. The logging road was barely wide enough for his truck, with branches scraping against both sides of his cab and trailer. His headlights were the only source of light in the pitch-black forest. The creatures persisted in their pursuit, but the narrow road and thick vegetation favored him, making it difficult for them to encircle his truck or launch an attack from several angles. Ultimately, just as David's fuel gauge was, David parked his truck and ran to the station, breaking a window to enter. The building was dusty and cold, but the logging road led to a clearing where a small ranger station sat dark and seemingly abandoned. However, there was a satellite dish on the roof and what appeared to be a radio antenna, suggesting that communication equipment might be available. Because the radio equipment was still working, he was able to call Dillon, a Forest Service dispatcher, who promised to send a search and rescue team to his location. The creatures spent the rest of the night prowling the edge of the clearing, watching the ranger station with their eyes glowing in the dark, but they appeared hesitant to approach the building, as if something about the building or its location made them. When a Forest Service helicopter spotted David's truck and the ranger station at dawn, the crew arrived to find him exhausted but unharmed. They also noticed that his truck had sustained extensive damage from what appeared to be large claws, but they were unable to find any signs of the creatures that had been pursuing him through the night. The official report attributed the incident to a combination of extreme weather fatigue and potential wildlife encounters. David's story of intelligent, coordinated creatures was written off as a hallucination caused by stress and hypothermia. While low-hanging branches and rough terrain were blamed for his truck's damage, David knew what he had experienced and carried that knowledge with him when he eventually resumed trucking. He never again drove the Idaho mountain roads alone, preferring to travel in convoys or take longer routes that the creatures were still hunting and using the remote wilderness of America to trap unwary drivers. They were also intelligent, well organized, and patient, able to plan intricate operations that could take weeks to complete. Most importantly, they kept him on busier highways with more traffic and better communication coverage. David began telling other truckers about the risks of driving alone through remote wilderness areas, particularly during severe weather when help was far away. Some listened, but most dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of a man who had spent too much time on isolated roads. They knew human psychology well enough to take advantage of our predictable reactions to danger. However, the knowledgeable drivers who had mastered the skill of following their gut started staying away from specific roads and going in groups when they had to go into remote locations. They were aware that there were predators on the roads that no safety handbook could adequately warn about. Organisms that hunt prey by utilizing the size of the American wilderness. Additionally, in a forest in the Idaho mountains, the snow never fully melts. The animals keep hunting at night in anticipation of the next driver who will leave the protection of civilization to far. They have learned to be patient from the interminable winters, shrewd from the hostile surroundings, and hungry from the seclusion that conceals them from in the modern world. Neither the wilderness nor the creatures who hunt its deepest do not sleep. Darkest recesses, where the distinction between hell and reality is as hazy as the ice on a mountain lake, and crossing it is as risky. Post your own unsettling experience in the comments section below if you work as a truck driver. Additionally, be sure to hit the notification button and subscribe to Verified Fears if these stories have left you wanting more. Because neither the highway nor the lurking monsters ever sleep. Be careful when driving around its edges.